What's up, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Barbados Walker. I'm your host, Andrew, and in this video, we're going to be talking about the good, the bad, and the rather unfortunate in Barbados. Now, the good is things that are good. Everybody knows what good is. The bad is things that are bad. Everybody knows what bad is. The rather unfortunate, however, you could classify them as bad, but taking a snapshot and looking at everything else involved, considering the history, considering the measures that are taken to address these things, I feel like they're rather unfortunate, maybe because they can be more easily resolved than the bad, right? So because I think that it's possible, with a lot of focus on it, it could be more easily resolved. I just don't want to classify it under bad, and I'm putting it in rather unfortunate. Although, honestly, realistically, it is just bad, right? So, with that out of the way, we're going to start this way. I'm going to look at the rather unfortunate ones first, and then I'm going to look at the good because we need some good news, and I'm then going to finish off with the bad. If you have a better order that you would like to listen to this in, then maybe leave it in the comment section below, and if I ever do a video like this again highlighting other things, I will do it in that order. But I think the rather unfortunate good bad is the order that I would like to hear what I'm about to say if I was the one on the listening end. That's just something I'm thinking about. Okay, let's begin. So, rather unfortunate, number one is crime surge. Crime surge, the increase in especially violent crime as recorded in 2024 is something that I consider to be rather unfortunate. Because in 2024, there was a record number of 49 murders, right? Which is 158% increase over 2023 statistics. And the 34 out of that 49 murders was firearm related. So if you remove the violence, the murders that happened due to guns, due to firearms, you're left with a smaller number of crimes, violent crimes, right? So the rather unfortunate part of this is that there was a sudden influx of illegal firearms in Barbados. And because of that, the number of people who had access to illegal firearms increased because I believe there was over 70 shootings reported. So the number of people with illegal firearms increased, which then increased the number of murders that were committed in 2024. And since then, the police has been cracking down on gun violence. We've seen news where a lot of guns were confiscated, and you see them on the news, and they're in dozens. Sometimes they're in dozens. And so the problem now is that Barbadians are in this interesting position where they are wondering, is the problem being dealt with? Like, are we expecting that we are handling the problem? Or is there still a lot to worry about? Like, the way the guns, the illegal firearms came into Barbados, have those channels been closed off? Is the police sure about what they're doing, or are they just figuring it out as they're going? Is there a concrete plan? Is there a concrete strategy? And this is also bad for tourism, which is part of Barbados' main source of income, which is one of its biggest economic drivers, tourism. If people feel that Barbados is becoming more unsafe, right now it's very, very low. The murder rate is about 18.2 per 100,000 people, right? As at 2024. So 18.2 murders per 100,000 people is quite low. And it's even low in the region. It's even low, like if you look at other countries like the United States or so, it's quite low. But if people feel like it's increasing, or not even statistically, like it can be one thing on statistics, but different when people talk about it. Like if everybody is talking about it and it becomes something that becomes very viral and everybody is saying, oh, Barbados is unsafe, Barbados is unsafe. If that becomes something that is viral and global and gets into the international news and stuff like that, then people might start becoming scared to come to Barbados, which will greatly affect the tourism of Barbados. And that is something that is very concerning, right? So apart from the murder is always going to be a very seriously horrible thing. But apart from the actual statistics and the stuff that Barbados is doing to control it and to reduce it and to catch the perpetrators and bring them to justice and all of that, Barbados also has to worry about the optics. How does it look, right? Because percentages like 158% increase and a sudden rise in gun violence and sudden influx of guns and all of that. All those things are very, very big headlines and they can go viral. These are things that have the potential to go viral. We've seen this even in the United States is a very good case study because we've seen a lot of what has happened in the country being documented, right? And we saw the effect of bad news becoming very viral and becoming very popular during the COVID pandemic. We saw the same thing during the American general election, the presidential election, right? If certain aspects of a story, certain bad aspects specifically of a story become very popular about a country, the country can suffer because of that, right? The country can suffer severely economically. Even the quality of life in the country can be reduced because of that. So this is something that Barbados needs to address. This is something that Barbados is addressing and is taking very seriously, which I like. But like I said, currently what it looks like is just rather unfortunate. That's why I put it under the category rather unfortunate, right? So the second one is that Barbados is a small economy. Right? It's vulnerable because it is a small economy. And small economies are usually very sensitive to external shocks. Right? So Barbados is about, I think Barbados GDP is about 7 billion as of 2024, if I'm not mistaken. Right? About 7 billion in 2024. And that is big in the region. In Eastern Caribbean and in the Caribbean region is big. I think in Eastern Caribbean is actually the richest, right, by GDP. But because it is relatively compared to other big countries in the world, and if you look at the actual number, 7 billion, it's small compared to, like, relatively speaking, it is also sensitive to external shocks. If there is something that happens, it can drop very fast, right? The GDP can drop significantly. We saw a similar or an example of such a thing happen in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic. I've talked about this before, right? 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw that almost every country had a dip in their GDP, right? There was a small decline. But if a country has $50-something billion and it loses $10 billion, for example, it still has a lot. But if a country only has $7 billion and it loses a significant percentage of it, that money, that shock, that stress will be felt significantly, right? So that is the position that Barbados is in. And unless Barbados is able to diversify its economy, look for other ways to make money, essentially that is what we are talking about, then Barbados is going to still be in this position where it is largely dependent on its existing industries, right? And that is rather unfortunate. Again, the third one, this is both good news and bad news in a sense, right? Good news and bad news. And that is that there is a public health strain Okay, so what do I mean by this? The National Insurance Scheme and the social insurance have recorded increased spending. And this is because there is an aging population and increasing pension burdens. So let me simplify that. Because the population of Barbados, and that's why I said it's a good news and rather unfortunate news, because the population of Barbados is healthy and lives long, right? Because it lives long, after a while you're going to have more and more older generation, senior citizens, especially if there aren't more people giving birth, which means there will be more people who are retiring, who are generally going to be developing health complications, because that's just what happens. The older you get, the weaker your body becomes, and so on and so forth. And you visit the doctor more often, generally, unless you're particularly conscious about health and you do a lot of things to mitigate that. But generally, this is how people age, right? So the older you get, the more you require health care services, the more you're depending on pensions, which means the National Insurance Scheme is spending more money. Ideally, there is going to be a young population that is replacing the workforce and increasing the GDP. But in the case of Barbados, because there isn't a high birth rate and you have more of the people living longer and reaching to senior citizen age and depending more on the government, we're seeing an increase in the spending of National Insurance Scheme and social insurance, right? So it's rather unfortunate, because obviously you want people to live long. Obviously you want to pay pensions. Obviously you want to take care of the aging population. Obviously you want good health care, right? And Barbados has all of this stuff, but then it comes at a cost. Literally, you have to pay for these things for them to happen. And again, that wouldn't be such a bad thing if there was a way to recoup that money, to get that money flowing back into the system. But because the source of the problem cannot be the solution of the problem, Barbados is in a rather unfortunate situation, right? So those are the three I have under rather unfortunate. The crime surge, specifically in 2024 and at the beginning of 2025, we saw 2025, for example, we saw in January, February, and March, but it's decreasing now. And then we hope that it decreases and goes down to where it was before, or even below where it was before, and then there aren't more surges. Then we talked about small economy vulnerability, and then public health strain and national insurance scheme spending increasing, right? So let's look at the good. If these are the rather unfortunate ones, what are the good things? The very first one I want to point out is that Barbados has a very high Human Development Index. Now, what is the Human Development Index? Human Development Index is a composite statistic from the United Nations Development Program, that measures a country's average achievement in 3 basic dimensions. So they're going to measure a long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and a decent standard of living. Right? Long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and decent standard of living. So when it comes to long and healthy life, that is one of the good things I have here. Barbados life expectancy is at 76 to 77 years old. That is on par with many developed nations, right? Many developed nations are either at the same point, or some of them are even below 76 to 77 years. So Barbados has a very good, long and healthy life. Access to knowledge is very straightforward. Barbados literacy rate is 99.9 to 100%, depending on where you're reading the statistics. But it's literally one of the highest in this region and even around the world, right? Very, very high literacy rate. Asides that, Barbados also has very good internet. And as we know, the internet right now is where we get most of the information, right? Most people are not going to libraries anymore and going and finding physical books. A lot of the information we get is online. We're not reading newspapers. We're not getting physical books as we used to, because the internet has way more information faster at the tip of your fingers. So because Barbados has that much access, because Barbados, let's put it very straightforward, Barbados has strong internet, and it's very, there are no restrictions around what kind of content you can get, right? So Barbados isn't like this dictatorship, censorship state that blocks your access to certain information. Barbados has very high access to knowledge. And then finally, Barbados has a decent standard of living. Like, you can expect electricity, running water, good jobs, and so on and so forth. So Barbados is ranked high. The actual number for the HDI is 0.811, which is very, very high. Very, very high, right? If you think of it like percentage, you're talking about around 81%. But that's not how it's measured. But you get the point I'm making, right? So very high HDI, which is great for the country. The second one I have is GDP per capita. GDP per capita is a gross domestic product per capita, which is the total value of all goods and services produced in a country in a year divided by its mid-year population. So you're basically measuring, like, if you take the country's average economic output per person, this is the number that you're going to get. And Barbados GDP per capita is $25,000. Now, why this is very high is because you're looking at the country's mid-year population. That is the population of everybody, the number of everybody in the country at the middle of the year, right? And we know that everybody does not produce in a year, right? Everybody, the population of a country in a given year isn't the same as the number of people that are actively in production in that year, because we have people who have retired, we have people who are infirm, people who are sick in the hospital, we have people who are too young to work, we have people who do not have employment yet, right? So there is actually a smaller population. It means that the people who are working in Barbados are producing enough, so much that if you take the what they are producing and you divide that total production by the total number of people in a year, it's still as high as $25,000 for a country that has only 282,000 people. So that is a very high GDP per capita, right? It's quite high, and it's really impressive. If you didn't know what I was saying the whole time, just remember that this is really impressive. And even if you take the purchasing power parity, PPP, which is that you take the actual GDP per capita and you see, okay, how much can that actually buy in Barbados? Like, it doesn't matter whether it's very high, but when you take that number, how much goods and services are you able to actually buy in the country? It's still high. It falls to between 19,000 to 20,000, but it's still high, right? It's still very high. So that is the second one. And the third one I already said is the life expectancy, which is quite long. If you have a good standard of living in a country, one of the things that you want to go with that good standard of living is good health and long life. Because it doesn't matter if you can have a good standard of living, but then you cannot live long enough to enjoy it. But in that case, then it wouldn't be called a good standard of living. But Barbados has it such that, you have good standard of living, you also have good health and long life, and that is part of the good things here in this country. Okay, so what are the bad things, right? The first one is the high cost of living. Now, we have a good standard of living, yes, but it also comes at a high cost. The cost of living in Barbados is very high. Anybody who has lived in Barbados long enough, or who is considering moving to Barbados, or who has moved to Barbados and lived here for a while, knows that the cost of living here is quite high. That is just the truth. And I mean, if you're looking at the standard of living, this is the calculation that you have to make when you're in Barbados. You're looking at the standard of living. You're looking at a stable democracy, a stable governance, and you don't have all the normal things that befall I would say befall people that are developing nations or developed nations, where there is a lot of tension in politics and a lot of tension in society as well. Barbados doesn't have that. Barbados is largely stable, right? So you have a stable governance, you have good economy, you have a good standard of living, you have access to knowledge, the internet, you have electricity, you have good clean water across the entire nation. To the best of my knowledge, I've read, and I don't know of any part of Barbados that doesn't have all these things that I'm talking about. Maybe a few places might not have, but you get what I mean. Generally speaking, if that comes at a price that is relatively higher than many other countries, the question you have to ask yourself is, are you willing to pay that, or do you think you can get it for lower at a different country? That is what people who are moving to Barbados are usually calculating. For people who are staying in Barbados, they have to also consider, like, do I have to be paying this much for the current standard of living I have in Barbados, or can I get the same standard of living for less at a different country, and you know, maybe I don't have to pay as much, or can I even get better by paying the same amount? Because there are countries that you can go to and you can get a better standard of living by paying the same amount of money that you're paying in Barbados, or even less. And Bajans are talking about this. People who move to Barbados are talking about this. And this is something that is a real issue in Barbados that needs to be addressed, right? Obviously. I don't know how it can be addressed. Normally, when I talk about these things, I usually have an idea. Say maybe the government can do this and maybe the government can do that. But right now, I do not know exactly what would need to be put in place to drop the cost of living. Because if it was a simple answer, I don't think any country would have a high cost of living. Everybody would have solved it by now. So it's more complicated than it sounds. I mean, in theory, it's just, well, the government should reduce the prices. But in practice, we're talking about a democratically elected government. And the strategies that involve just the government should reduce the price tend towards a dictatorship, where the government is a dictator, right? And the government just tells you, well, you can't sell your product at that price, you have to make it this price. At that point, you're moving away from what is actually giving you a good standard of living to something that might have other problems that you will then need to solve. So that's where Barbados is in right now. It's bad, and I don't know how it can move forward, but that is something people will think about. The second one is that Barbados has an import-driven energy, right? Barbados depends on import-driven energy. What does that mean? There's a high reliance on imported fossil fuels for energy in Barbados. So right now, let me again put it simply, Barbados doesn't Barbados doesn't produce the refined petroleum that it needs to power the nation, right? It doesn't do that. So when petroleum, crude oil specifically, is extracted in relatively small quantities, it is exported, and then for energy, Barbados imports fuel into the country so that you can have gas for cooking, for your cars, for whatever, gasoline, and so on and so forth, and petroleum, and all the other things that you need. This is not great for the country. I put it down on bad because it is one of the things that makes Barbados extremely vulnerable when there is conflict in the world or in the region. Because if the thing that you need to power a nation needs to be imported, then it means that when there's a crisis or when there's a sudden increase in maybe the price of refined petroleum or crude oil or whatever, or where there's conflict in the regions where you're importing from, or where the channels that you're importing all these things through is blocked because of some conflict, then the country suffers severely, right? So that is why if there is a problem in the Middle East, it can affect Barbados. If there is problem in the Caribbean region, it can affect Barbados. If there is anything that affects the way crude oil or petroleum or gasoline or whatever is being imported and exported, Barbados is going to suffer for it because Barbados does not produce any of those things, right? So it's also not something that you can just start producing, which is something I've talked about in previous videos before, because Barbados has small land. I've said this thing many times. Barbados is a small island, relatively small island. So it cannot afford to just dedicate large portions of one part of the island to producing certain things, especially if those things come with very high pollution that need to be managed, right? Pollution that needs to be managed. So if you're going to start refining crude oil in Barbados, let's just use that as an example. If you're going to start refining crude oil in Barbados, you first need to build the plants, the facilities that are going to do that. You also need to worry about the waste. Where will the waste go? Then you also have to worry about the air pollution. Barbados air quality is very, very good. One of the best in the world right now, given that almost everybody is polluting its atmosphere. Barbados has very good air quality with the greenery and the lack of significant air pollution. It has very good air quality, right? So you have to worry about that. You have to worry about the air pollution. You have to worry about water pollution. You also have to worry about land pollution. And all of this is just because you want to build one crude oil refinery. So this is something that unless, and this is not just for Barbados, unless the world in general figures out a way to move from fossil fuel, and then Barbados finds a way to implement that technology or that strategy locally, Barbados is, for the foreseeable future, going to depend on fossil fuel, which means it's going to be affected by anything that happens in the region, in the Middle Eastern region, because that is where a lot of the fossil fuel is coming from. In the Middle Eastern region, decisions that the United States makes to, decide to go to war with a certain country or not to go to war with a certain country. Like we see there are tensions between the United States and Venezuela. I believe it's Venezuela right now. And stuff like that. All of that is going to affect Barbados. And I don't know what Barbados can do differently to come out of this very precarious situation, right? The third one, and this is one that is heavily debated in Barbados, is, and I think it's a bad thing, Barbados has a very low birth rate and total fertility rate, right? If you look at this graph, I just want to show you this graph. This is from Macro Trends. Barbados birth rate for 2025 is 10.52, which is a 0.17% decline from 2024. So it's low and it's declining. And if you look at 2022, 2023, 2024, it has been declining. If I highlight this graph right here, you will see that it went, look at the graph. It's just falling, free fall. And this is live births per 1,000 people, which is difficult to understand. But if you look at the total fertility rate, it's easier to make sense of it. Barbados has a total fertility rate of 1.7. which means 1.7 births per woman, right? So what does that mean? The number of children a woman in a country needs to have for the population of the country to remain the same or to replace basically, as people are dying off, new people are being born, and the country's population can be maintained, is 2.1. So basically, some women are having 2 children, some women are having 3 children, and then the number balances out, right? In Barbados, however, the total fertility rate is 1.7, which means most women are having less than 2 children in Barbados. This is statistically. Most women are having less than 2 children in Barbados, which is not enough to replace the population. Coupled, in addition to that, there is a net migration of minus 70 per year in Barbados, which means a net migration of negative means that people are leaving the country, not being added. So if you take the number of people that were born in Barbados, coupled with the number of people that moved to Barbados and made Barbados their long-term residence, you're going to have negative 70 people a year, which means Barbados is losing 70 people a year, right? So that number is high. Now, of course, when I talk about total fertility rate, I just want to clarify this. It doesn't mean that every woman is giving birth to less than 2 children in Barbados. No, that's not what it means. It means if you take the average, right? So there could be one woman that gives birth to 5 children, for example, and then like 5 other women don't give birth to any children, and then one other woman gives birth to 1 child and one woman gives birth to 3 children. But when you take the average of everybody, it comes down to 1.7. That's what that total fertility rate means. It's also not considering every woman in Barbados. It's talking about women who have reached an age where they can give birth. And I think for the sake of this calculation, it's talking about women who are at or above the age of 27. I believe that's the number, right? So there are a lot of factors that are involved. But basically, that number is supposed to be 2.1, and it's at 1.7 right now. And it's declining, as you saw with the birth rate per 1,000 people. The number keeps declining. And when you look at that number, it's like people don't want to give birth because the cost of living is high and they're not getting the jobs that they want to get. And there are so many reasons which make sense. But even though it makes sense, what many people are not thinking about is the underlying implications of what these numbers mean. If you have population decline, you're going to have workforce decline, right? If there are no new people being born into a country, and as we saw, we have a net negative migration. So people are leaving the country. So people are not being born into the country at a fast enough rate. People are also leaving the country. You're going to have workforce decline. There are going to be less people working in Barbados. If there are less people working in Barbados, you're going to have production decline, right? If 10 people can make $1,000, 9 people will not make the same $1,000 as the 10 people are making for the country. So there's going to be production decline. And if those 9 people turn to 8 people, the production is going to decline as well. It's common sense. So if there is production decline, you're going to have in general, economy decline, right? The amount of money that a country makes, the GDP of the country, is dependent on the amount of production in the country, which is dependent on the workforce of the country, which is dependent on the population of the country, right? So a decline in the population will lead to a decline in the economy long term. This is not something you will see immediately. This is the long-term effect over a long period of time. But that economic decline is going to then speed up the decline in population. Why? Because if people are already leaving the country now and there's a decreased birth rate, which will then lead to a whole bunch of stuff, then it means that when the economy reduces even further, when the jobs are getting worse, like people are not getting jobs and economy is declining or whatever, more people are going to leave. There is going to also be less inclination for people to want to have children and have babies. So this is just a vicious cycle, a self-perpetuating cycle that one thing leads to another, which leads to another, which leads to another. Now, obviously, Barbados hasn't gotten to the point where the government is coming up with some very crazy ideas. Like if you look at the ideas that the government is coming up with in China, in Korea, in Japan. Look at those ideas. In many of those Asian countries where there is a very steep decline in birth rate and in total fertility rate, we see government coming up with programs where they're basically paying for people to have babies. They're paying for people to get married. They are paying and hosting dating events, right? You can look it up. Specifically in Japan, in China, and in Korea. You can look it up. And why would these countries be focusing on that? Because when you run the numbers, when you do the analytics, when you do the estimates, you see that in the long term, it's very bad for the country. Not to mention the implication when you're looking at it in decades, centuries, and millennia, right? Because it could get to a point, and I'm not saying it has gotten to that point yet, but it could get to a point where after a while, a population becomes extinct, which means they cease to exist. If you extrapolate these numbers 500 years from now, there will be no Barbados, no Barbadians, right? No native Barbadians, because nobody will be born after, but the population will keep declining and people will keep exiting the country and becoming citizens and nationals of new country and continuing those countries, for lack of a better word, bloodline and growing their economy and all of that Barbados is going to suffer. Now, that is a drastic oversimplification and outrageous estimation and extrapolation of what is going on right now. But these are some of the things that economists consider. These are some of the things that people who are very interested in thinking about and calculating the future of a nation have to consider, right? Especially if you're not just thinking about, oh, what are we going to eat tomorrow? But you're thinking about long term. Are we setting up the country that it gets to a point that it becomes almost irreversible, right? You now have runaway decline, right? So these things have to be considered now. But when you look at the approach that people have towards it and the current mindset, especially when you look at the news and you hear interviews, the prevailing sentiment about this stuff is that people just don't want to give birth because the cost of living is quite high and job opportunities are not great. Do you get it? So that it's bad. It's bad. That's why I put it under the bad category, right? Because I don't know what Barbados would need to do differently. And there could be ideas, there could be solutions. I'm sure people who are in charge of this are thinking about it because, I mean, Barbados, when you look at the Human Development Index, you don't get to a point where the United Nations thinks that you have a very high, and this is by United Nations standard, you have a very high Human Development Index. You don't get to that point by simply not taking things seriously and winging things, just going off on a whim. You get to that point by being very strategic, being very calculated, coming up with innovative decisions, right? So I'm very sure somebody somewhere in an office is working this out, talking to some other people in some other offices, working with everyday Barbadians, Bajans on the streets, talking about these things, trying to come up with solutions. When those solutions present themselves, I will most likely talk about them on this channel. But for now, I don't know. So if you're one of those people who is currently working on this, or you know some ideas that I didn't mention, or you have some other insights that you can, give to enlighten us, please leave it in the comment section below. I love reading your comments and responding to your comments. And I will see you in the next video. Thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.